I hope I am audible. Yeah? Yeah, good. When Krishnaji was at Ojai, California, and he was staying in the Pine Cottage there, and there were other foundation trustees staying in California. They had come to visit that place. Among them were Mrs. Sunanda Patwardhan and Mr. G. Narayan. So, G. Narayan was actually Krishnamurti's nephew. Yeah, and Sunanda Patwardhan, she was one of the trustees of the Indian Foundation. So, this incident is mentioned in Sunanda Patwardhan's memoirs. So, she writes that one morning Krishnaji had just had his bath. He was still in his bathrobe, and he came and sat in the drawing room, and he called for these two persons, both G. Narayan and Sunanda Patwardhan. So, when they entered there, Krishnaji said to them that Buddha is here, ask questions. And both of them, they felt a different kind of energy, a different kind of atmosphere there in the room. And there was a different kind of brightness and glow on Krishnaji's face. So, both of them were very much overwhelmed. They sat there in that overwhelmed state of mind. They just didn't know what to say, what to ask. So, then Krishnaji himself asked them, what is the essence of his teachings? Then G. Narayan said, you are the world and the world is you, seems to be the essence of your teaching. Then Krishnaji said, observer is the observed, is the essence of the teaching. And then they had little bit of talk, and then they dispersed. But it was very distinct atmosphere. Both of them were overwhelmed. So, Krishnaji himself saying that observer is the observed is the essence of his teachings, which means that if you understand this one statement rightly or realize the truth of it, then it is very easy to follow what he is talking about and to understand. So, therefore, we thought that why not have a full workshop on this topic, which is so important. And so, probably we will begin from scratch. So, you do not have to have read Krishnamurti at all. And reference will be our life, what happens in our life. Starting from there, we will come to this statement, observer is observed. And then we will also try to find out who is this observer, what is its nature and structure, how does it come into being, and what role it plays in our life. And then we will also go into whether it is possible to realize this, that observer is observed, and then what are its consequences and how it will affect or can affect our life. So, human beings have been suffering probably since the beginning of time. Every human being suffers. In fact, there is a interesting story in the tradition where a person is asked to bring a shirt of a person who has not suffered at all and he finds no such person. And then the story of course takes a different turn, says that when he did find that person didn't have a shirt. So there was no question of bringing his shirt. So which means that the suffering is a very common part of our life, and it seems that we have taken it for granted that a human being has to suffer sometime or other, in some way or other, and all that he can do is just to put up with it, adjust with it. If possible, find the causes of suffering, try to eliminate them, but then there is no total freedom from suffering. And it seems that the human beings have accepted this suffering as the way of life. But probably they have not found out that they themselves are responsible or cause of this suffering. Means their actions, what they do or what they do not do, all that seems to help in creating this suffering. Now, if you look at what is suffering, what actually happens when a human being suffers, what exactly is that state of mind? When the things do not happen as per your wishes, as per your desires, then you suffer. You want something, but you don't get it, you suffer. You say something, the other person doesn't accept it, he contradicts it, so you feel bad. Anything which goes against your wishes, that causes the suffering. Which means that the basic cause of suffering is this conflict. The conflict at all levels, at the physical level, at the psychological level, at the intellectual level, and conflict also human beings seem to have accepted as the way of life. And the conflict between two human beings, conflict between two communities, two religions, conflict between two countries, and the whole history of wars which human beings have gone through. And war is just a conflict at individual level expanded or extended to the level of the country. So the quarrel between two persons extended to quarrel between two nations. Causes and reasons are more or less the same. The property, the money, the power, the favors, all these things, whatever are the causes for the conflict between two individuals, same are the causes of conflict between two nations. So, why human beings have not been able to live in peace without any of this conflict? Is it the human nature itself which likes conflict, creates conflict, or what is the basis or the root of this conflict? So, you see, the conflict begins because for conflict there have to be two parties at least. A single person cannot be in conflict. Now, you may say that, but a single person can also be in conflict within himself. But within himself also then there are two things. He has conflicting desires. He wants this, but he also wants that. But if he has this, he can't have that. and therefore the conflict, whether I should go for this or go for that. So, two things are always involved in conflict. And so, the conflict, the cause of conflict between two human beings is this division, this duality, this separation. Now, you may say that, well, we are already separate, we are distinct human beings, I am different than the other person, and so it is naturally there. So, if this division is naturally there, then the conflict is also natural, you can't do anything about it, and therefore you have to just accept or do whatever you can do with it, adjust with it and accept life as it is. Physically, we may be different, we may be two different bodies, but psychologically, are we different? This is the question to be investigated. Are human beings psychologically different, or whether they are similar? So, if I ask myself, what am I psychologically? Then whatever that I have gathered and stored in my brain, that is my psychological content. I have lived my life. I have lived my life by interacting with the environment. Through that interaction, I have gathered lot of knowledge, lot of experience. All that is stored in the brain in the form of memory, and that memory is the basis of my life. That memory is the basis of my interaction with the environment. And so, we have a lot of psychological content which we have stored in our memory. Now, if we examine this psychological content, then what do we find? We find we have fear, we have violence, we have jealousy, we have a sense of insecurity, we have occasional joys and pleasures, we have pain, we have memories of suffering, all that psychological content. I have in my life, I have in my brain as the memory, and if I examine the memory of other human being, I find the same content. You pick up any human being in any corner of the world and examine his psychological content, you will find the same content. He also has fear, he also feels insecure, and all the other things. Not only that, but the same psychological content had been there in human beings since they came into existence. So, if you consider the ancient man, he also was afraid, he also was feeling insecure. A human being living in a cave, he was feeling insecure, there was fear in him. All the other psychological contents which we have, even the ancient cave man also had. So, which means that human beings have not changed psychologically, and which also means that psychologically all human beings are similar, because they have the same psychological content. Now, you may say that I do not agree with this because his fear is different than my fear. He is afraid of darkness, I am not afraid of darkness, I am afraid of something else. I get angry because of X, but he does not get angry because of X, he gets angry because of Y. So, his anger is different than my anger, his fear is different than my fear, his jealousy is different than my jealousy. So, the details of the reactions or the psychological content may be different, but the reaction, the psychological reaction itself, is it different? When I say fear, then fear whether in me or fear whether in any other human being, it's the same. If it were not same, I wouldn't have called it as fear, because there is a psychological reaction in me and there is a psychological reaction in other human being. Now, why do I say that that psychological reaction is fear? I say that the reaction in me is the fear and the reaction in him is also fear, which means that the reactions are similar. Otherwise, I wouldn't label them with the same label. Otherwise, I would have given different label to his reaction. So, which means that the nature of these psychological reactions, it is same or similar. Therefore, the same label applies there, but the details, the causes could be different. And so, if we consider ourselves psychologically, then we are all similar. We have the same psychological content. If we have the same psychological content, then why this division? Why do I say that my psychological reaction is different from the other person's psychological reaction? Which means that there is a factor of separation. There is a factor which separates me from the other. Now, physically we are different, we are separate, no doubt, but this feeling, this sense that I am separate from the other human being, I have my own concerns, the other human being has his own concerns, and there is this sense of separation. Now, that is the psychological division. If you feel psychologically separate from other human beings, then that is what we call as the psychological division. You are psychologically divided, and wherever there is a psychological division, the conflict is inevitable. There will be conflict. And so, the root of the conflict is this psychological division. This feeling, this sense that I am separate from others. See, even in our personal life, we have so many people living in one family, or we are living with another person. The moment there is a sense of separation, you must have found that the conflict begins. Because this is what I like, and the other person says, but I don't like that. And so, there is a psychological separation, that my likes are different than your likes. So, whose likes should prevail, and the conflict begins. And this psychological separation, it's a feeling, it's a sense which you actually feel in yourself that you are separate. And when there is such a separation, you may be related with another human being, but actually there is no relationship because you don't feel related. So, although two persons are living together physically, psychologically they are separate. They don't feel together. There is no sense of togetherness, but rather there is a sense of separation. And this is quite a common experience, even among the married couples. Each one has his own interest, his own likes and dislikes, and when they are not able to meet psychologically, each one just pursues his line of interest. So, although they are staying together in the same house, psychologically they are separate. And this separation happens at every occasion. Like say, a person may be seated in a meeting and some proceedings are happening in a meeting, and yet if a person is not interested in what is happening or in those proceedings, then he is psychologically separate from the rest of the group. Although physically he is there together, but psychologically he does not have that sense of being together, he is separate. He feels that whatever is going on probably has nothing to do with him. And so that psychological separation is there. And this psychological separation actually, it dictates our life, our behavior. Because whatever we consider as mine or my things, we treat it differently. And whatever is not mine, then I treat it differently. And this is valid in every circumstances. My anger is justified, but his anger is not justified. I had a definite reason for my anger. The other person is unnecessarily angry. The reason is not that reasonable of the other person. When it is my thing, I am protective about it, I care for it. If it is not mine, I do not care what happens to it. So, the way we treat public property and the way we treat our belongings, right, it is decided by this sense of psychological separation. Whatever we are identified with, wherever we have our identification, which we consider as me and mine, there we behave differently. And where I have nothing to do with those things, then there is negligence and no care, that kind of thing. And this attitude operates at all levels throughout our life. My son versus his son, my ideas versus his ideas. So, even in a dialogue, my point of view versus other person's point of view. And then if somebody contradicts, then I end up in defending that point of view. And so, you will find that this sense of psychological separation operating at all levels, leading to conflict. So, the psychological division is the root of the conflict. But how does this psychological division take place? Why this psychological division? Why this sense of being separate from others? So, that is where this observer comes. Who is this me? Who is this self? The self who is the observer, the self who is the experiencer, the self who is the thinker. What is this entity which creates this sense of separation? Because if you ask yourself a question, who am I? Now, apart from the body, what would be your answer? Apart from the body, you may say my name, my experience, my knowledge, whatever that I have gathered, stored in the brain, all that is me. But all that, is it always permanent? See, the interesting thing is, all your content of the brain can be replaced by another content. In fact, we have this now, the technology is moving in the direction, artificial intelligence is just the beginning. But when the total memory of the brain of a person can be replaced by another memory. So, which means that whatever you consider as yourself, all of that is completely replaceable by something else, and then that something else will be your identity. And when you are something else, you have no clue what you were before that. Totally different identity. But that is what we are. Physical body, that is one factor, but through that body, the whole function is taking place on the basis of this psychological content. And how have we gathered this psychological content? We have gathered it by interacting with the environment. So, you see, a living being has to interact with the environment. If it does not interact, then it is considered as dead. A person in coma is not interacting with the environment, so he is regarded as good as dead, although the body is alive, but the person is dead. Many times the doctor declares that he is brain dead, which means that there is no conscious interaction taking place through that body. So, which means that every living being has to interact or is interacting with the environment, and when this interaction stops, he is no longer living. And in this interaction, whatever that human being goes through, whatever he experiences, that he gathers and stores in his brain as the memory. And from that memory, he responds. And that response gives rise to the next event, the next experience, and the whole process is repeated. And with every experience, there is an addition in the brain of the knowledge that is gathered from that experience. And this process goes on right from the birth until a person dies. And if people believe in reincarnation or life after death, then even beyond the grave, this process continues. So, whatever the person has gathered and stored in the brain as the memory, the psychological, it has psychological content, it has factual, means the factual information or knowledge which is required for carrying out day-to-day activities. But also there is a lot which is probably not useful, but still we are holding it in our brain, and we don't know why we are holding it, because there are memories of hurts, there are memories of pleasure, there are memories of pain. A person had been sick for a long time and suffered, so there is the memory of that suffering, and then the fear associated with that if I fall sick again, then I may have to suffer again in the same way. So all that is there. And with that we are living our life. So all this psychological content is gathered as we interact with the environment, as we live our life. And when it is gathered, there is an identity. And that identity is what holds this psychological content together. And that identity or that center is the observer, the thinker, the experiencer. Without the observer, the psychological content can't be held together. Now, you may ask, what is the necessity of holding this psychological content together? Because that question also arises. If it is not held together, then it's better, in fact, then there is no entity as the me or the self, and therefore the root cause of conflict then will not be there. But why this self came into being in the first place? So for that you have to consider what is the basic concern of a living being. For any living being, the basic concern is the survival. A living being has to survive first. Only if he survives, then all the other things related with life, they can happen. If the person is not able to survive, then it's all finished. So survival is the most important concern of a living being. And any kind of threat to the survival is not acceptable. The living being has to learn to face that threat, to overcome that threat and protect itself. So which means that every living entity has to learn to survive. So then learning is essential. Without learning, survival is not possible, and without survival, living or life is not possible. And if he has to learn to survive, if it has to protect itself from all kinds of dangers, then first of all, he must at least become aware of the danger, because if he doesn't know, he is not able to sense the danger, then he can't face it. This danger has to be sensed first, only then you can take some action with respect to it. But if it is not sensed, then you don't know even that there is a danger, and then a living being will lose his life because he is not prepared to face that danger. And so the psychological reaction that brings this awareness of the danger, we call it as fear. It is referred to as fear. So when there is a sense of fear, the living being is looking for the danger. The danger is the cause of the fear. So, fear is maybe a kind of protective mechanism of that living being, and therefore, he becomes aware of the danger and then able to take steps. So, now once you allow a psychological content, because then it becomes necessary, because without fear he can't sense the danger, and once the fear is allowed, then all the other content will naturally gather there, and if it has to be held together, because only then the living being will be able to survive, and that is where then this sense of the me or the center. Now, this sense is not that strong among non-thinking living beings, like say plants or animals. Plants do not have this sense of me or mine, but still you find there is a struggle for the resources, like say in a forest there is a struggle to get more light. So, each tree is competing with the other tree to get more sunlight, so by growing taller than the other tree and so on. So, there is a struggle, but there is no sense of the self there, but yet there is some identity, some existence which holds this life of that entity together. In animals, particularly those animals who are in contact with human beings, they have some sense of this self, because they do show the psychological reactions of jealousy and likes, dislikes and so on. But with human beings who have this thinking capability, this is very obviously visible that there is this self, the sense of the self, a center around which the whole thing moves. So, if this is the way the self as the center has come into existence, one may say that it looks natural, it is naturally there. And does that mean that this conflict which happens in our life then is also natural? There is an interesting experiment done on the rats. The scientists found the center in the brain which was responsible for fear. So, if that center is stimulated, the rats will feel fear, they will be afraid. So, what they did, they benumbed that center, so that the rats will not feel fear at all. And such rats then were freely moving about, and they were not afraid of the cat even, and then became easy prey of the cat. So, if this experiment indicates that maybe this sense of fear is necessary in order to realize the danger and take the appropriate steps, maybe among non-thinking living beings that is the case, but human beings who are capable of thinking, do they have to have that sensation of fear in order to see the danger? Can they not visualize the danger and make provisions to face that danger. And that we find that yes, human beings are capable of that, because we make provisions for so many future possibilities. We do the saving, we do this, we do that, and the more imaginative you are, the more kinds of situations you will imagine and will try to make provisions for those situations. And if you can do that, if you can see the danger, is there a need of this sensation which we call as fear? And if it is not necessary, then why are we still going with it? We have inherited it definitely from animal kingdom, because from animal we have moved to human kingdom. Now we are human beings, but whatever that we have gathered as animals, we are still continuing with some of that. And although we are capable of living intelligently, we are still living as per the animal instincts. So, this self, this sense of the self, which has arisen out of this psychological content, and the psychological content has arisen because from the animal kingdom we have inherited it to the human kingdom, and then we have made a lot of contribution into that by our thinking activity. And all the time there is further and further addition to this psychological content. But we have never questioned that is it really necessary to gather this psychological content. Because with human beings there are lots of different possibilities. For animals there is no choice. They have to live with fear because that is their protective mechanism. With human beings that is not necessary. But if they still continue to live in the same way, then they are not living as human beings, but they are more or less living like animals. And what this psychological content does, it plays havoc with our life. That is the cause of all the conflict. This content is divisive, and therefore it is my content versus your content and so on. Because of this psychological content, we are not able to think logically and rationally, and our actions which are based on thought, then they also become illogical and irrational. And this you can see actually in your life. In a given situation, you may find a certain course of action as the most logical and rational, and yet psychologically if you do not like it, you will say that no, I am not comfortable with this. So, I may go in for some other action which is not that rational or that logical. And this we find, I mean, it is very common thing. Cigarette smoking is injurious to health. So, the rational and logical action is not to smoke. But I like smoking, liking is the psychological content. I like that pleasure, so I end up in smoking. So the action is not logical or rational. And this way, it is creating situations in our life. There is conflict and the suffering that results out of that conflict. So now the question arises, this self as the center, which is holding all this psychological content together and giving it continuity, can it come to an end? Can it be ended? And it's an important question, and probably many human beings are even afraid to ask this question. Because we have said that our whole identity is this content. And if this content is completely removed, then we have no identity. And when we replace that content with another content, then we have a different identity. So does that mean that we will just become vegetables? Because there is no more anger, there is no more fear, there is no more jealousy, there is no psychological content. And if there is no psychological content, then who am I? What I am as a human being? And the fear of being nothing prevents you from asking this question, whether the psychological content can come to an end. Now, is human being really nothing? So Krishnaji says nothing means no thing. So human being is not a thing. Human being is much more than that. But not in terms of thing or things of the mind. But what is that much more aspect of human existence? What is that dimension of human existence which is completely different from this psychological content? And how one can discover it, how one can go about finding it. So that we will go into as we proceed in this workshop. But I think at this point I will stop and invite questions from you to take this dialogue further. So please ask questions, and there is no restriction of any kind as to what questions you can ask. You can ask any question, and we will move with that question further into this topic.
Good morning to all. Sir, at the beginning of the talk, you said that suffering is created by the individual. But in a real life situation, when a close member of the family dies because of old age or disease, whatever, we all suffer. But that death has not been created by me.
Yes, that's right. You see, death is an event. on which I have no control. It has happened. But in response to that event, what has arisen in me, that arousal is what I am responsible for. I have a sense of loss. I was attached with that person, and now that person is no longer there. I have lived with that person for so many years, had so many fond memories of my life with that person, and then that person is gone, no longer with me. So there is a sense of loss, and with that sense of loss, there is suffering. So death as an event is not my creation, or is not my this thing, but the response which has arisen in me to that event, that is my creation, that is my this thing. And therefore the question arises that why such a response arises in me. And naturally I have gathered a lot of psychological content in me by way of living with that person, and all that content, now I have a sense of loss, and then there is the consequent suffering.
Sir, Krishna also has gone through suffering when his younger brother Nitya died, maybe for a week or so, appears to be. And my question is suffering necessary for enlightenment?
Yes, it's an interesting question. Now, if you ask on the basis of understanding, then suffering is not necessary for realization or liberation. But what actually happens in a person's life is that he suffers, and therefore he is seeking the freedom from that suffering, or suffering makes him aware of the causes of the suffering, or at least makes him question, make him ask why this suffering. And when he starts asking questions, why this suffering, which means he has been awakened. Otherwise he was asleep, he didn't know what was happening, and the suffering has awakened him, and therefore he starts questioning, and then the learning triggers, the learning happens. So we have said that learning is life itself. Life is not possible without learning. To live means to learn to survive, to learn to unfold, to learn to act. And if a person is not learning, not acting, that means he is asleep, and therefore the suffering happens. Because when he is asleep, he is not able to respond to the environment or to the situation or to the circumstances adequately. He is not able to respond to that adequately. And any inadequate response to a situation will lead to suffering, because it will lead to unacceptable, unexpected consequences, and therefore the suffering. And the moment he suffers, then he wakes up and says that, oh, why this suffering, why it has happened, and then tries to find out the causes and so on. And so then the learning process is triggered. So for a person who is already in the state of learning, all the time learning as a movement, then for him there is no need of suffering to awaken him. Then he is aware of the situations as and when they arise, and because he is awake, he is learning, he is able to meet those situations adequately and finish them there, and so that there is no suffering involved there at all. And Krishnaji's case, when his younger brother died and he suffered, and it took almost 10 days for him to come out of that suffering, because he was traveling to India in a ship, and when that ship was passing through Suez Canal, he received the telegram saying that his brother is no more, and he was so attached to his brother. He had so much probably the content, own brother, yes, that he felt that loss. And in fact, he had a conviction that his brother will be with him. He thought that his brother was the essential part or factor of the work that lied ahead in front of him. And so he was almost convinced that his brother will not die, will survive. But then he died. So it was a great shock, and it took him almost 10 days to come out of it. But when he came out of it, it was very clear. There was no residue of that event left in him at all. It was all finished, gone. Nothing to be held back. No memory of that, nothing. Yeah. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your comments, and just I'm remembering few of Jackie's quotes. One was, he says, always be pliable. So second thing, he says, you are the world. We are the world, but we have never felt that.
Yes.
Like I'm whole, clean, you state, everything straight, but I never felt that. Similarly, one more quote of Jackie's, he says, whenever someone is died, some part of you is died. Means I am part of that, we have never felt that. Till now we were there. For example, 2-3 days back, my son got the fracture. So when he got the fracture, I was not suffered at all. But after listening to him, so my listening means I started there. So the thing is that what we are creating, means which is already dead. So I am creating I, what you call Krishnaji says it's sensations. So our sensations are already dead. The self or the awareness or intense awareness we are not having, what as you said. So the complete vanishing of the I or the self-center, like contents of consciousness are emptying. So we are always wanted to maintain that like photography like thing rather than a mirror like thing, as you are saying, as continuous learning, or I am always there. So mind is interested, or the self-center is interested in the transient things, so or the time things, not the timeless things. So the conflict happens between the timeless and the which is in time. So I wanted things, or want itself is created by the time. Similarly, one more thing he says is like impatience has time, patience has no time. So thank you very much for the good question and answer.
Yeah. Paresh, you can go ahead with your question. Yes.
So, does you're saying when brother died, his brother died, it was feeling like suffering for 10 days. Does it mean it is the psychological suffering or the normal pain?
Yeah, psychological suffering.
So, I remember asking you the same question before when you were mentioning K has this, K has stepped out of psychological suffering, but he still has pain. So, how does it correlate to this one?
No, I haven't understood the question.
Okay.
He's saying pain and suffering suffering are different.
So he's saying K should not have felt psychological suffering because he can only feel pain. That's what he's saying. He's out of suffering psychologically.
You see, he was greatly attached with his brother. So attachment is the psychological content. And when he lost his brother, then naturally he suffered because there was a sense of loss, and probably that was the first and last suffering probably Krishnaji underwent. Because there was no earlier occasion of such suffering in his life, and there was also no later occasion of such suffering in his life. So probably that is the only suffering he went through.
But sir, in a real life situation, when somebody in the family dies, if I say I am not attached to him, so it's all right. Others will say you are a human fellow.
Yeah, that's right.
You see, if somebody has passed away and if you don't show the sorrow on your face, then others are not going to like it. They will say, oh, this fellow is...
For the sake of others, you have to show your sorrow. Yes.
Namaste, sir.
Yeah.
When we have physical pain, I go directly into the physical pain and resolve it completely.
Yeah.
But with the psychological suffering, why I go to escapes and indulgence in other things? Is this suffering is not intense enough to go into it and resolving it? What are the factors involved in it? Between both physical and psychological things.
So you are asking that when there is a physical pain, we do something about it and immediately to get over the pain, like say toothache, you go to the dentist, get the tooth extracted or whatever it is, and be free of that pain. But when there is psychological pain, we don't seem to act that quickly. In fact, we seem to bear with it, or probably it just continues, or probably I'm not, or probably I don't know what I can do about it.
Many things also associated with this. I'll go to rituals or some astrologer or anything. Tradition.
Because when you don't know what you have to do when you suffer psychologically, then you will try this, you will try that, then there will be suggestions. If you knew precisely what needs to be done, then you would have done that. But because you don't know what can be done or what should be done, therefore then you will try to look for somebody to tell you what can be done. And then there will be various suggestions, and then as per those suggestions you may approach those things, then try this, try that, and if it helps you get over the suffering, well and good. If it doesn't, then keep on trying.
But sir, the physical pain can also become psychological.
Yes.
The moment you say why me,
Yeah.
that means it has become psychological.
Yes. Yes. Yes, sir. Please. Similarly, when his close family members or his close associates with whom he has lived for a long period, when they have died, has it was there any reference of his feeling his suffering?
Who's Krishnamurti's? No, he was attached only with his younger brother. That's all. He was not attached with anybody else.
Not to any family member? No.
Yeah, please hear.
Is there any cause of sense of separation? Is there any part of the brain itself, there is some biochemical reaction which is always making, creating a sense of separation within ourselves? Is there a solution? Something, is it possible to enable to make? Is there any connection? Chemical reaction, biochemical reaction within the brain?
Probably you are asking that just as they could find the center in the brain responsible for fear and benumb it so that the person will never be afraid. So similarly, if they can find centers which are responsible for suffering, which are responsible for other things, and therefore benumbing those centers, then person will never be suffer, he will never suffer at all. So probably that is the quickest solution or answer for the human suffering. All that they have to do is just to find out the center in the brain, benumb it, and then the human being is free of suffering for all time to come.
The sense of separation.
Yeah, I mean, it goes with everything. Suffering is just one example we have taken, but it goes with everything. If there is a center in the brain which is responsible for this sense of separation, benumb it, right? And if you start benumbing all the centers in the brain, then finally the person is brain dead. Yes. So it is like you feel insecure and you start building walls around yourself in order to be secure. But when you build walls, you are separating yourself from the main flow of life. See, life is a movement. It's not isolation. And when a person isolates himself from this flow, then there is decay. Krishnaji has given a very good example because he has a center near Ganga, Rajghat center, and staying there he said that the river flows very close to that Rajghat center, and in that flow of river he said that some part of the river, because the water was receding, it was summer time, and because the water was receding, some water got separated from the main flow and became a little pond. And in that little pond, for a few days it was okay, but later on the things started rotting in that little pond. There was decay, there was foul smell, and then finally it dried up. So if we isolate ourselves from the movement of life, the main current of life, then that is what will happen to us. There will be decay. And if you don't separate yourself, then you have this fear. You are afraid of suffering, and so on. So isolation is not the answer for the suffering. In case of intense suffering, maybe you need to protect, because probably otherwise the system will break down. And to prevent that breakdown, maybe you need some kind of protection. But that's okay. I mean, but once the situation is over, you can always break down the protection. You don't need it anymore. But to keep oneself isolated from this movement of life is the invitation for decay, the deterioration.
To make the separation, it is very easy. Like normally it is happening by itself. But to get connected with the connected feeling with all the life as other human being, I feel it is needing more effort. Why it is not?
Yeah, that's right.
You see, first a human being separates himself and then tries to reconnect. Then naturally, as long as the separating element is active, lot of effort will be involved in trying to reconnect, because this active center, which is all the time separating, it will resist that connecting activity, and therefore one will feel that yes, one has to do a lot of effort, and yet the center may prove to be too strong to be overcome, and then all the efforts to connect they may come to nothing. And we can see that happening in life. Say we are in conflict with another human being. We know the reasons, we know the causes, and we try to reconnect with that human being through various actions, through various this thing, that thing, and all those things, right? But if we have that sense of separation at the core of our heart, then whatever efforts you may do to reconnect with that human being, they will come to nothing. Somehow that human being will feel that yes, all this looks very superficial. Probably that person actually really doesn't want to reconnect, because he is hiding that sense of separation in him, not showing it up, but what he is showing is his efforts to reconnect with that person.
Inside one, outside one, like he says again, same.
And so probably that is not the correct approach.
Conflict itself becomes
Yeah. So first find out why this separation, what is this factor which is creating this sense of separation, why is it there in the first place? Once that is gone, then you don't have to even try to reconnect. You will get reconnected. Yes, sir.
There are cases of head injuries. Yes, patients who got into coma and they recovered also. There are sometimes they talk in different languages. Totally, married to the language. Suppose there's a person in Hyderabad who is in accent, he talks in Japanese language, it has been recorded. Okay, so how do we relate this? Is it that, though K did not believe in rebirth and all that, but what is the connection? Why did he talk? There should be some meaning of that. Something should have recorded. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. What is your take on that?
And you are saying that yes, the incidences of a patient going in coma and then coming out of that state of coma, and then he is able to speak a language which he never learned and spoke. And so, how do you explain this? Now, I don't know how to explain this.
Many times he says, even K says that more than 10,000 years, the mind contents, maybe now it has been exposed. Like many of the
No, but that person, see, he never knew, say, German language. He was, say, born in India, never spoke German or learned any other language, the European language probably. And so, how can he suddenly start speaking German?
whatever we say, that it will be theory only, not practical.
No. If he can fluently speak German language,
Past life German or previously.
past life. So that is what his question is. Now, if you give that as an explanation, then you accept that there is some such thing as past life, and maybe he learned past life in the past life this German language, and now suddenly he remembers it from the past life. And if he says that, but Krishnaji says there is no continuity, that means he doesn't say that clearly, but he doesn't contribute to that there is a reincarnation and those things. And then if we go by what Krishnamurti is saying, so on that basis, how can you explain this phenomenon? That is his question.
Or is there the radio channel suddenly get tuned by that frequency and then just started playing?
Yeah, must is going to do that. There are a lot of things are going to happen.
No, see, explanation can be given of this phenomenon, and that explanation is based on the unity of consciousness. That means the consciousness which each human being thinks is separate, his consciousness is separate from the consciousness of other human beings. But Krishnaji doesn't contribute to that. Krishnaji says that there is the totality of human consciousness which holds all the content which each individual unit of consciousness has. And therefore, if you consider the totality of human consciousness, then all languages are there. Now, could be possible that because of the coma, the brain injury, maybe a center in the brain got awakened which could receive the content with respect to the German language, and therefore the fellow started speaking German and so on. In that way it can be explained. Yes. So there doesn't have to be a reincarnation to explain this, but it may be explained this way. And this, the possibility of this happening also exists because they say that if a human being learns some skills, then because of his learning those skills, it becomes easier for the other human beings to learn that skill. Because a breakthrough has been done, and then it becomes easier for the other human beings to learn those skills. So this we can see happening, that these children, they are very much gadget savvy. These operating or using the gadgets, they are very quick in that. I mean, you can recall how much time you took to figure out how to use the smartphone and what all the functions and all these things. Now this young generation, in no time they are able to operate all that, and in fact the elder ones have to learn from them. And so we see the evidence that earlier the human beings have learned these skills of using a gadget, and the next generations they find it easier to learn. Or maybe there will be a generation where they don't have to learn, they will be born with those skills. So right from birth they will be able to operate these gadgets and so on.
Probably they may have more space than us, because our country, with our experience, we have gathered so much, but they are still coming up. Possible?
Where you begin with the talks about duality, is there this observer is observed as a non-dual, what other teaching is talking about? Like, is there any relation? I was just curious about it. Like when somebody talking about Ramana Maharshi, other art teaching, they are talking about that non-dual state, which is the solution for all these things. Like, is there any connection? This observer is observed statement with the non-dual.
Yeah. The observer is the observed. This statement indicates non-duality. It is the observer which creates duality, and therefore the conflict. But without the observer, there is no duality at all. Then there is whatever it is. We will be going more into this. We have more sessions, so we will go more into this.
Even one place he says when observer and observer are separated, mind is created. As such, there is no mind, the gap or the space.
He doesn't use the word mind in that way. He says the thought, the thinker. Yeah. The separation between observer and observed is the creation of the thinker, the thought. Yes. Sir, he has been wanting to ask questions for a long time. Yeah, please let him ask, then you ask. Yeah. What's your name, sir? Oh, Srinivas. Yeah, please go ahead, Srinivas.
How to be free of the psychological content?
So that's what we said that we are going to explore in our next dialogue, because we have brought our exploration up to a point, and we said that, that point is this question, and then we'll take up that question in the next session after the break and go into it.
So, the sense of love, when it happens as a shock. And after that, the effect takes and goes to a different form. Or, especially when it happens at a younger age, without even knowing. So, later also, when something happens to you, it happens as a shock. The sense of loss especially. But the effect of that is much more longer, which goes in a different form. So how to really be aware of it, and I feel that you don't have any power except adopting that sense of loss all the time.
No, I think the question is not very clear. You said there is an event, there is a shock due to that event and a sense of loss. Then what next?
Yeah, there is a sense of loss.
Yes.
So that comes as a shock to you.
Yes.
So you just don't know what to do. So you just hope up for that.
Yes. Yes.
But the effect is going to last for a longer time,
Yes.
and it defines the individual or it knows the individual in certain way.
Yes.
So after getting molded, then you may say that no, this should not be there, and then you try to correct it. But and how to really make that adoption, that effect part of it, not to minimize, because this is I'm asking my. So that's.
Okay, no, okay. I think I got your question. What she is asking is, some event happens which gives you a shock because there is a loss, and that feeling of loss, psychological feeling of loss, you don't know what to do with it. You are not able to get over it, and therefore that sense of loss staying there with you, you are not able to do anything about it, somehow then molds you. That means it goes into your conditioning, you get conditioned by that, and then which will change your behavior or response to subsequent events or happenings. So which means that what she is saying in essential is that a psychological experience which is unresolved going into the memory, and then from that memory you respond to further events. So which means that psychological conditioning is now going to influence your responses for all the future events. And there may be many more such stored psychological responses in our brain, because we don't seem to be able to end our psychological experience, and therefore we seem to record it and store it in our brain, and we have a large storehouse of such psychological memories. And then she is asking, how does one get over it, or what can one do about it? How to get over this psychological experience or content which has already become part of your conditioning? That is the question. So, which essentially means whether it is possible to end the psychological conditioning, which is the same question as Mr. Srinivas asked, and we said that we are going to explore it in our next session.
So that, we're talking about the ending of the self-consciousness, the frustration, the anxiety, fear. So, are we also not going to end the empathy, enthusiasm, energy along with these things?
That's a good question. Yes, because along with the negative, will the positive also end? So a person that means has lost everything, both positive and negative. So that's where we said that the human existence, is it only this psychological content, or there is a human existence which is not this psychological content, but which is completely different, maybe a different dimension of human existence, whether there is such a dimension. So that we'll have to investigate. So there are lots of things we have to go into because we have these 4 sessions in this workshop, and I think all aspects of this will be investigating, because this is a major question, cannot be answered just by 1 or 2 statements, whether there is a different aspect of human existence which is not based on this psychological content, which has nothing to do with this psychological content. So that's a big question. Yes. We'll go into it. Yeah, Venu?
Manu, follow-up question to Sandran's question. That the statement that observer is the observer is also essentially a non-dualistic state of mind. And in what ways are Krishnaji's teachings a departure from all the other non-dualistic teachings? Because nowadays there are so many people who talk about that non-dualism has become a movement. But it doesn't seem to help anyone, because everyone is craving for that non-dualistic experience. So if time permits.
Yeah, I think probably what is happening here is that the people, the other schools of philosophy or other approaches, without inquiring into why there is duality in the first place, they are trying to achieve the unity or achieve non-duality. What I am trying to say is that they say that yes, there is a duality, and because of duality all the problems, and therefore there has to be non-duality. So there is a pursuit of non-duality. I want to get non-duality, I want to have that unity. And so all the effort, everything, then sadhana and all those things. But they are not addressing the basic question that why there is this duality in the first place. And Krishnaji is pointing at that. He is saying that find out why this duality, what is its nature, why it is there. And through understanding the nature and the structure of this duality, when it is ended, then you don't have to seek non-duality. All others are seeking non-duality, while here he is saying that find out why the duality is there in the first place. And when there is no duality, that's it, you don't have to seek non-duality. I mean, that is the approach which is different than the traditional approaches. Because in traditional approaches, there is always this becoming. I am violent, so I should try to be non-violent. So I project a goal of becoming non-violent and try to pursue it. But if I find out why I am violent in the first place, and if I am able to end that violence, then I don't have to become non-violent because the violence being not there, I am already non-violent. One doesn't have to seek it. So I think there is a difference in the approach here.
Is non-duality means the separation between the God and the man, isn't it? That's what my understanding. I mean, there is a God, and you are one with the God. You are not different from the God.
Yes.
That's the basic premise.
Yeah, that is the non-duality.
Yes, yes. So is it time for the break? Okay. So we'll stop